Hello again. As you now know, Fordham has canceled classes in person for the duration of the semester. So I'm afraid you're going to have to get used to seeing me in this mediated form. All right, Lecture 3 on the Magic Mountain. When we left Hans Castorp last time, he was in a characteristically conflicted state as he realized that his proposed 3-week stay at the Berghof was nearing the end. Even as he tells himself that he will soon be returning to begin work as an engineering intern in the flatlands of northern Germany, he yearns to stay on for the 3 reasons I noted last time. First, because he loves the contemplative life there. Second, because he's drawn erotically to Claudia as an embodiment of Dionysian sensuality that reflects a submerged part of his own nature. And finally, because Hans is dangerously fascinated with the spectacle of disease and death all around him up at the Berghof. Well, what will allow him to stay? As we've seen in Mon, the desires that we repress from awareness and repress into the unconscious manifest themselves in the body. The body is a kind of page upon which unconscious desires are written, as Dr. Krakowski holds. And the language of those desires is inscribed in the body, Krakowski holds, and Mon certainly seems to suggest. It's inscribed in the form of disease symptoms. So we are then hardly surprised that Hans, who has already coughed blood and had a bloody nose, exhibits another sign of interior disease on the eve of his departure. He tells himself that it's just a bad cold, but the sanitarium with its sterile premises isn't a place where people get colds. Instead, Hans's congestion is yet another manifestation of the tubercular infection that he suffered during his adolescent love for Prislav Hippie, and that was reactivated in a new spot on his lung through his desire for the similar-looking Claudia Chauchat. When the comical head nurse, Nurse Mellendock, a wonderfully Dickensian figure, when she visits Hans, she tells him that his catarrh isn't just a local or, quote, innocent infection. Now, that's an interesting word, for indeed, there is nothing at all morally innocent about Hans's still unenacted desire for Claudia that is the primary cause of that infection. The nurse consigns Hans to bed rest and sells him the sign and symbol of the Berghof, a badge of tubercular belonging, as it were, a thermometer to monitor his temperature. Now, both Behrens and Krakowski, remember, recognized that Hans was tubercular on first seeing him. They sensed it, and the nurse now does as well, all of which is soon confirmed by Behrens' diagnosis. But even before this, Hans realizes that he is infected. He realizes it himself when he reads the mercury column on his so-called glass cigar during the rest cure. After, finally, a lucky turn, the image became clear. He held it tightly and hastily applied his intellect to the task. And indeed, Mercury had stretched himself very robustly. The column had risen rather high. It stood several tenths above the limit of normal body temperature. Hans Red had a temperature of 99.7. Between 9:30 and 10, in the middle of the morning, his body temperature was 99.7 degrees, and that was too high. It was a fever, the result of an infection of which he had been susceptible, and now the question was, what sort of infection? Well, far from distressing Hans, this evidence that he very likely has consumption fills him with pleasure, not dread, especially the thought that he will be near Claudia Chauchat, and even more the thought that he and Claudia share the same illness. Hans, during this period in which he has recognized his high temperature, he imagines that he is in a dining hall, fantasizes smiling at Claudia, whom he has watched at this point for nearly 3 weeks, and imagines that he is saying in this smile to her, "You see, I'm sick. I'm still here." Well, later that morning, after taking his temperature. As Hans is on his way to get his diagnosis, he is exhilarated to see that exact same smile he had imagined on his face actually on Claudia's lips. It seems to confirm her secret knowledge that he too is sick, and to signify to him her pleasure that he will be remaining there as a fellow patient. For Hans, Claudia's silent smile seals their mutual awareness of a bond forged through the inseparable fusion of disease and desire. We are told that the charming patient had slowly turned her head, and a little of her upper body too, to gaze plainly and openly over her shoulder at Hans Castorp's table. And not just at the table in general, no, quite unmistakably and very personally at him, a smile playing on her closed lips and her narrow Prislav eyes, as if to say, well, it's time. Are you going home, Hans? Because when only the eyes speak, things become quite informal, although her mouth never once said Hans Castorp. His mind was reeling at this sight. Now, Behrens confirms that Hans is indeed, in diagnosis, quote, an old patient. That is, one whose scar tissue indicates a previous infection and whom the tuberculosis has now revived in what Behrens calls a fresh area, a new moist spot that Behrens detects both through osculation, tapping Hans's chest, and then through his stethoscope. Behrens says he suspected this infection from the start, and he explains that in this strange paradoxical environment of thin, dry mountain air, that the same air, the same climate that combats consumption first has the effect of bringing it forth, so that in a sense it accelerates the manifestation of the disease that it is then intended to cure. He says that is what we call a muffled tone, Hans. And muffled tones come from old inflections where the calcification has set in, a kind of scarring, if you will. You're an old patient, Castorp, but will not lay the blame on anyone but your not having known before. As for the air up here, it's good for fighting off the illness, wouldn't you say? And you'd be right. But it is also good for illness, you see, because it first enhances it, creates a revolution in the body, causes latent illness to erupt, and your catarrh, no offense intended, is just such an eruption. Thus the paradox of the atmosphere of the place itself. Now, what Behrens, this man of science, does not know, but which Krakowski, the psychiatrist, does, is that the mountain air isn't the only or even the primary cause of the renewal of Hans's consumptive infection, which had lain dormant in his body for well over a decade. Krakowski knows that infection was volatilized by some passionate but still unenacted desire in Hans. Indeed, Krakowski is there during this diagnosis, and as Behrens is offering his medical explanation, Krakowski is listening and taking notes as if he knows that his own psychological reading, of course, of Hans is being confirmed. Consider Krakowski's curious response at the end of this diagnosis. We are told, Dr. Krakowski, however, stood up and strode over to Hans Castorp, tilting his head to one side and smiling so pithily that it revealed the yellow teeth under his beard. He placed one hand on the young man's shoulder and with the other offered a hearty handshake. If Krakowski's smile recalls those of Hans and Claudia prior to the exam, it is, of course, in some ways because he's aware, in some sense, of the meaning of Hans's renewed tuberculosis is rooted in desire, though he does not yet know that it is for Claudia. Nonetheless, the smile suggests and recalls that smile of the two of them. But what's more peculiar than the smile is the hearty handshake that concludes this chapter. It seems to be partly a smug confirmation of his own theory. In a certain sense, it's almost self-congratulatory. But it is also a gesture of congratulations to Hans, as if to say to Hans, now you've gotten exactly what you had wanted, even though you would try to disavow that desire. Now you are in a position, Hans, to act on the suppressed desire that has produced this sickness. Now, you note that Krakowski is certainly right in this, and yet there is something decidedly unsavoring in Mann's description of Krakowski. With his black coat and his yellow teeth and his pointed beard, he is made to seem unmistakably demonic, specifically a kind of Mephistopheles from the Faust legend, that is, a devil tempter who offers to impart a kind of forbidden knowledge, in this case to Hans. Now, in the case of Krakowski, the forbidden knowledge is the frightening secrets about the mysteries of Hans's own unconscious. Krakowski discloses such repressed forms of knowledge to his patients in his dark underground consulting room. But the other thing about him is that he moves about the Berghof in mysterious ways that seem vaguely supernatural. Soon, for example, while Hans is confined to his bed, Krakowski makes an unannounced visit. Entering from the balcony, he seems to materialize out of thin air in Hans's room, just as Mephistopheles in Goethe's Faust materializes in Faust's chamber. Hans, you'll remember, in his dream, had run from Krakowski because he feared what Krakowski could reveal, and feared in particular that Krakowski would reveal in some way a sexual insufficiency within him. But we also noted that Hans was fascinated, riveted by Krakowski's lecture on love as a cause of illness. And as he listened and seemed in some way to understand its relationship to his own state, he was feasting his eyes at that time on Claudia's supple arm. Now Hans finds himself still more receptive to Krakowski's conception of the psychological origins of disease. As we're told, it was on a Monday that Dr. Krakowski had first materialized in Hans's room. We say materialized because that is the best word for the strange, almost terrifying impression he made on Hans Castorp, no matter how hard he tried to shake it to that day. Despite what happened, Krakowski said at your examination, from my viewpoint, which is different from that of my distinguished supervisor Barron's, this moist spot here, and he lightly touched Hans Castorp's shoulder with the tip of his finger, cannot be regarded as the primary object of interest. It is merely a secondary phenomenon. Organic factors are always secondary. They always have a psychological cause. Hans' eyes flinched, and yet he was fascinated because although these visits never fail to have a certain dubious aura about them, one can eventually become accustomed to dubious things if they remain within limits, and Hans Castorp soon found that he had no objections to Dr. Krakowski's regular materializations. Hans is titillated at the thought that his undeclared passion for Claudia has had such a magical and transformative effect upon his body, even though it is a deleterious one. Such corporeal mysteries no longer frightens Hans as they did at the beginning, even though perhaps they should. Now they rivet him all the more. And thus he says of Krakowski to his cousin, the things that man knows, he's a regular fountain of information. Listening to him makes you think there's something to those stories about love potions and the other stuff they talk about in the old sagas. Well, when Hans is initially confined to his bed, we're told that he bursts out with, quote, a wild laughter of triumph and an expansive joy. And he does so because he is, of course, getting what he has unconsciously desired. What he has consciously desired here had previously been complicated by a need to believe that he was going back to the flatlands. It was complicated by feelings of, quote, fear and alarm. But these concerns about either the seriousness of his disease or the problem of postponing his internship, those initial concerns quickly fade as Hans increasingly delights in a state in which he has the leisure now to think and reflect and speculate. And remember, that was one of the things that caused him to long to stay in the Berghof, even though he had tried to repress that desire. Well, confined to his bed for weeks, Hans is surrounded by new sources of knowledge and the ability to simply think that trigger speculation, so that his long convalescence is, for Hans, never boring. And indeed, during the course of it, even though it is regulated by a particular medical regimen at every point in the day, he feels the time during this convalescence initially, this rest cure, never drags. The rest cure gave Hans Coxtorp an opportunity to feast on his impressions of the first 3 weeks up here and to meditate on his current situation and where it perhaps might lead. A little later, we're told that the day would be chopped up into little pieces by all these synthetic divisions of time. They had in fact crumbled in his hands and turned to dust, and he would notice now, either into cheerful amazement or its worse, with a little pensiveness, that despite the regularity, there was nothing boring going on at the Berghof. Quite the opposite. In fact, he tells his cousin that given the chance to listen often to Herr Settembrini and to have him up here lend a conversational hand, I think I almost want to stay feverish indefinitely and just sit right here with you all. It wouldn't be very long before they would have to give me a silent sister, keep me from cheating because I want to stay so much. Okay. Now, like all the patients at the Berghof, Hans monitors his temperature at various points in the day with religious regularity and attentiveness. But unlike most of them, Hans understands that the measurements fluctuations reflect not just the processes that are going on within his body, but also that they reflect his psychic state as well. In short, the thermometer interprets for Hans his own moods and his own shifting and turbulent feelings. In this respect, the substance in the column of a thermometer is particularly apt. Mercury. Mercury is named, after all, from the Greco-Roman god. And Mon reminds us of this when he refers to Mercurius. He would have us understand that Mercury, or in Greek, Hermes, was a god known for specific things. First, for swiftly changing movements. Remember, he has winged feet. But Hermes, Mercury, was also known as the god of messages. He would deliver messages. He would present pieces of information. Hans loves taking in bits and pieces of information from Karkowski and Settembrini and others. Thus, Hermes is associated with the notion of messages or interpretation. Thus, the word for interpretation that we use, hermeneutics, is derived from his name. Now, Hans himself, as he watches the mercury move up and down in the thermometer, Hans is himself an interpreter. He listens and he thinks and he interprets what he hears. Even when he's asleep, he now finds himself making discoveries, interpreting the world and himself through self-analysis. This is something that Krakowski would surely applaud. The hours of slumber were, however, animated for Hans with varied and lively dreams, and he could go on indulging on them even while lying awake, and when he wakes up, he interprets his own dreams. When morning drew near, he found it amusing to watch the objects of his room gradually grow visible, emerging from under a veil of gray, to see daylight kindle outside, sometimes only smoldering murkily, sometimes catching fire. He interprets what he sees around him, even the daylight coming, with a kind of fascination, in a way that, again, suggests the pleasure that he takes in this life of a kind of reflective passivity, but not an intellectual passivity. Now, Settembrini, of course, who comes to visit Hans, would be horrified by Hans's tendency to remain passive physically and to interpret his own dreams and be interested in the life of his unconscious. Settembrini, of course, presents very different ideas to Krakowski's about the nature of sickness and the relationship of mind and body. These are ideas that the ever-curious Hans absorbs with equal fascination to Krakowski's and with similarly a fascinated but skeptical critical appraisal. Settembrini's first gesture when he visits Hans in his bedroom is to switch on the light, okay? He doesn't materialize out of nowhere, it seems, the way Krakowski does mysteriously. Rather, he enters, switches on the light, and that's appropriate for a humanist like Settembrini, who through reason wishes to bring enlightenment, progress, clarity, and perfection to man and society. For Settembrini, sickness is not a manifestation of love, but rather sickness is what he calls an expression of some kind of depravity, something disgraceful, shameful, almost immoral. Sickness as an indignity, Settembrini says, because illness hinders man's aspiration to rise above physical contingencies through rationality and the mental labor needed to create a perfect democratic world order, which is the ultimate end of history and the end of all rational development in man, for Settembrini. So Settembrini is therefore appalled that Hans is ill at all, and even more, that Hans seems so clearly to embrace his illness as a mode of being. Settembrini, as we've seen, is an Apollonian artist who celebrates ideal form and rational proportion, but he regards Hans not as a potential fellow artist or fellow intellectual. Rather, he sees him, rather reductively, as a bourgeois, a man who he says would best be served and would best serve mankind by returning to the world that he left behind in the flatlands. As Settembrini puts it, returning to the form of life into which you were born. Well, clearly, Settembrini underestimates Hans's compound complexity and Hans's potential to absorb information, question ideas, and compare points of view. Hans tells Settembrini that he has come to view the bourgeois world that he left in a new way. He now sees it as, quote, cruel and ruthless in its crass materialism and crude imperviousness to higher thought and ideas, as, quote, people down there make money and just stuff their bellies. Well, consider Settembrini's response to this. When Hans says, the air down there is cruel and ruthless, lying here and watching from a distance, it almost makes me shudder. Settembrini does not like this at all. I would not like to see that idea take root, because a man who gets used to making that charge can very easily be lost to life, to the form of life into which he was born. Do you know what that means, my good engineer, to be lost to life? Well, it means in part to be lost to the function of use that you should have in life. Settembrini sees Hans in danger of surrendering to several perils, to the specific corrupting intellectual influence of Krakowski, to the Dionysian temptations of sexual desire for Claudia, to the moral corruption associated with that, and also he sees Hans dangerously surrendering to his own desire for free intellectual experiment and enrichment in multiple directions. All of these things he sees in Hans, all of them genuinely there, disturb Settembrini. But above all, Settembrini is disturbed because he perceives quite accurately again that the most dangerous tendency of all in Hans in his early state is Hans's fascination with death. One that I've noted for Hans reflects both his spiritual aspirations but also unmistakably his fascination with corporeal decay. After listening to Baron's disquisition on the chemical decomposition of the body in death through oxidation, Hans notes that life and death involve the same processes, that growth and decay, life and death, aren't simple antitheses, that in some way they inhere in one another. Death is both inevitable and ongoing in life. The difference between life and death, Behrens tells him, is that in life there is form, in death there is a dissolution of form. But Hans is fascinated by the connection between the two. Behrens says that when you die, decomposition takes over, and the body resolves into simpler chemical compounds, into inorganic matter. Decomposition, corruption, Hans Castorp said, but that's really just a kind of burning off, isn't it? it all binds with energy, if I recall. Absolutely correct. Oxidation. And life, that too, my lad, that's oxidation. Life is primarily the oxidation of cell protein. That's where our pretty animal warmth comes from, of which some people have a bit too much. And yes, life is dying. There's no sense of trying to sugarcoat it. It's a description of the organic, as the French once put it in a flippant way, the Frenchies have. And it smells of dying, too, life does. And if we sometimes think otherwise, it's because we have a natural bias in the matter. And so if someone is interested in life, Hans Castorp said, it's death he's particularly interested in. Isn't that so? Well, there's a certain difference all the same, Behrens said. Life means that the form is retained, even though the matter is being transformed. But why retain the form, Hans Castorp asked. Why? Well, now listen here. There's nothing the least bit humanist about a comment like that. Oh, humanism? Hans said. Form is namby-pamby nonsense. Oh, now this is a decidedly unspiritual fascination in Hans with death at this point. Because when Behrens notes that in death there is a breakdown in the form of organic matter, and it is in fact the form of that organic matter that distinguishes life from death, rather than celebrating life as form, Hans declares form is namby-pamby nonsense. Well, consider, Settembrini, the exponent of ideal formal beauty in art and life, would be horrified to hear this because in this Dionysian comment, Hans is deliberately striking against the Italian's Apollonian values and belief that life has value as form. The form of the body is less important than certain ideal forms, but nonetheless, it seems at this moment that Hans wants to, or is ready to abolish the value of form altogether. Now, this is only a shifting position, but it's a significant one here. The fact is, though, and I say it's a shifting and temporary position, the same Hans who was clearly so riveted by Behrens' description of disease-ravaged bodies under his surgical knife, in ribs resections and pneumothorax operations, and in bodily decay, the same Hans Castorp who was fascinated with that aspect of death and life as a constant dying biologically, is also interested in death in the exact opposite way we saw as he gazed down as a boy at his grandfather's grave. He also reveres death spiritually as a solemn mystery. And so, again, in this section of the book, we find him making comments such as this to his cousin Joachim. He says, I've sometimes almost wished I had become a clergyman, Joachim, what with my interest in sad, edifying things. You know, like a black funeral pall with a silver cross and R.I.P. on it, requiescat in pace. That's the loveliest phrase, and I find it personally much more appealing than something rowdy like he's a good jolly fellow. Now, note that Settembrini acutely sees in Hans both of the sides of his attraction to death, both as a kind of spiritual mystery and as a endlessly fascinating state of organic collapse. And Settembrini regards both aspects of this fascination with death as unhealthy, even as inhuman. Thus, he cautions Hans, who is all too happy to be sick and all too interested in human mortality, to resist any fascination with sickness or with death. Settembrini says, death is to be honored only as the cradle of life, the womb of renewal. Once separated from life, it becomes grotesque, a wraith, or even worse. For as an independent spiritual power, death is a very depraved force, whose wicked attractions are very strong and without doubt can cause the most abominable confusion in the human mind. Whether it's a spiritual power of attraction to death or a physical attraction simply to the spectacle of decay, wrong. Death can be valuable only insofar as it is a source of renewal, that through generations, mankind moves upward and forward. Now, in Settembrini's desire to save Hans from the perils that he sees tempting the young man, he even tries to drive Hans back to the flatland through mockery. He tries in some way to mock Hans's manhood by ridiculing his bedridden passivity as that of, quote, a young nun with great martyr's eyes. Well, remember Hans's dream in which he revealed a certain insecurity as he saw Krakowski pursuing him, grabbing his leg. But even this, notwithstanding that insecurity, even this mockery that would seem to intensify it, isn't enough. This ploy also fails then. But in attempting to save Hans, in attempting to redeem Hans from this plunge into the profane sensual mysteries of the body and fascination with death, the curious thing is this. Settembrini is, without knowing it, enacting part of the Gnostic myth that I described, which undergirds Mon's entire vision of life. You'll recall that Adam Quad Mon, in that monomyth, falls to earth after seeing his own reflection, and in embracing that reflection in the material world becomes a double-natured creature, both spirit and matter, and is torn between his competing desires to get back to heaven on the one hand and the realm of spirit and its attraction to revel in materiality on the other. Well, there's a second phase to this myth that I haven't described yet. Here it is. Another part of the Hebraic myth holds that God sees this fall into matter on Adam's part, and he sends to redeem him a spiritual emissary who is supposed to try to save Adam, to bring him back, remembering that part of Adam wants to get back. This emissary in the Gnostic myth is another creature of light and pure formal perfection, all right, as Adam had been. But the mission fails. And in some versions of this story, it fails because this second figure becomes mired in matter himself. Now, this does not happen to Settembrini, who fails as a spiritual emissary to bring Hans, so to speak, back to where he believes he belongs, insofar as Hans resists his advice. But Mon does suggest this second part of the Gnostic myth, and the emissary getting stuck in the world in which he's been trying to retrieve Adam. He suggested in other ways in the novel. For example, the Mexican woman called Tuledu, her second son came to the Berghof to visit and to retrieve the first son, only to fall ill himself as well. And of course, it is exactly this that happens with Hans and Joachim as well. Hans, as emissary, had hoped at first to expedite Joachim's return to the flatlands through his visit, and instead, like that emissary in the Gnostic myth, he becomes himself contaminated with the same disease, embracing it even more and relishing it a great deal more than his cousin. Settembrini sees from the first meeting that he has in Hans a individual who is resisting what Settembrini believes is best for him. And he tries to send Hans back, not to the realm of spirit, if you will, in some Apollonian sense, but to send him back, at least he hopes, to a place of bourgeois restraint where he can live out the life he was born into. Now, Hans listens to Settembrini respectfully, if skeptically, and he is happy to let the humanist offer his own forms of instruction, but as we've seen, only to a point. But, as I've noted, Hans is by no means the passive student Settembrini, or for that matter, any of the other instructor figures in this novel, Naphtha, Krakowski, or others would like. And as a result of this intellectual activity, while Hans respects aspects of Settembrini's Apollonian world vision, he also, as I've noted, challenges him by noting some inherent inconsistencies. I mentioned these last time, and we're going to see several of them in the subsequent conversations. But early on, Hans points out perhaps the most obvious and incontestable inconsistency in Settembrini. It's this: if Settembrini regards sickness as a disgrace, as an indignity that is incompatible with form, reason, and work toward human progress, then how is it that Settembrini himself is a consumptive? Hans says, You're a dyed-in-the-wool skeptic and a critic, Herr Settembrini, if I do say so. You don't even believe in exact science. Does your plate show spots, though? Your X-ray plate? Yes, it shows a few. And you really are ill, aren't you? Yes, unfortunately, Settembrini said. I am rather ill, he replied, and hung his head. There was a pause, broken by his cough. Hans Castorp looked up from his bed at his guest, whom he had reduced to silence. Perhaps the only time Settembrini is reduced to silence is when confronted with this massive contradiction. He can't explain why he is ill, why his tuberculosis recurs, given the fact that intellect is antithetical, he believes, to disease. But Settembrini repudiates the idea that his illness has anything to do with unconscious desires, for indeed the very concept of the unconscious, of the Freudian id with its transgressive urges and desires, absolutely repels Settembrini, and he denies that it can exist in himself. Yet Settembrini cannot deny evidence of such perversity in human nature at large. He offers, in fact, Hans cautionary stories that almost amount to parables of patients that he has seen at the Berghof who fell fatally in love with the underworld of sickness so much that they could not function outside the asylum, and even stories of those who embraced their sickness so thoroughly that they couldn't bear to be cured. He tells of a woman who jumped into an icy lake in the hope of getting sicker and raising her temperature so as not to have to go back to her old life. But perhaps the most fearful example of such an addiction to bodily disease is the hypersensual Frau Stur, a woman whom even the broad-minded Hans finds revolting. Now, we've already seen that sexual desire can cause disease, and that in reciprocal fashion, disease often increases sexual desire as it intensifies bodily appetite. But in its most extreme and perhaps absurd manifestations, like Frau Stur's, disease can become itself a source of sensual and sexual pleasure, not a stimulus to erotic desire, but a form or almost a kind of substitute for erotic pleasure. Consider this description of her. Frau Stur, in particular, became wildly talkative very often. She expatiated on the pleasures of coughing. Yes, there was something perfectly delightful and enjoyable, she said, about a tickle in the depths of your chest that got worse and worse until you reached down for it, squeezing, pressing to let it have its way out. Sneezing was just as much fun. The way you felt a sneeze swelling up with a vengeance inside you until it became irresistible and you breathed in and out in one great frenzy and gave yourself over to the bliss of it, your face drunk with pleasure. You could forget the whole world in that blessed eruption. No wonder Mann can later refer to a sneeze as an orgasm of the nose. The Berghof is full of individuals who love to describe their diseases, and in Frau Stur we see an individual for whom disease itself is a perverse pleasure. Now, the Berghof is also a place full of instruments of diagnoses, thermometers in the simplest sense, but they can only read so much. There are other gauges, of which the newest and the most important is the X-ray. Mann's description of Hans's X-ray, in his journey to the X-ray unit, is one of the climaxes of the novel, certainly the first half of the novel. And indeed, the X-ray itself becomes one of the novel's richest symbols. I'm going to turn to that scene in just a moment, but first I want to say a few words about Mann's narrator, who calls attention to himself periodically as the detached and ironic presenter of the story we're reading. In doing this, the narrator shatters the illusion of reality, the suspension of disbelief in which he has immersed us, and reminds us that this is all a fiction. This is all a story that I'm telling and controlling, and insofar as I'm telling it, of course, I'm reminding you that it's not reality. Consider, for example, at the beginning of the Eternal Soup and Sudden Clarity chapter. The narrator says, "And now we have a new phenomenon about which the narrator would do well to express his own amazement. It's only to prevent his readers from being too amazed on their own. The fact is, the account of the first 3 weeks of Hans Castorp's stay with the people up here, 21 days at the height of the summer, to which all calculation it was supposed to have been limited, had consumed quantities of time and space that correspond only too well to what the author himself expected, and indeed have confessed. The coverage of the next 3 weeks of the visit, however, will require about as many lines or words or even seconds as the first 3 weeks required pages, choirs, hours, and working days. We can see it coming. We'll have those 3 weeks behind us, laid up now in no time. Good order and good laws of narrative require that our experience of time as readers should seem long or short, should expand or shrink in the same way it does for our hero of our story, Hans Castorp. Now, the narrator's self-dramatizing reflections here on the book that he is writing, the story he is telling, and on how he is making us experience that story in its temporal progression, all of this, of course, is a form of metafiction. That is, the narrator is producing a work, or Mon, in this narrator, is producing a work that is aware of its own audience, that reflects on its own making, its own constructions. Readers find this jarring. Some find it annoying, because the fact is that most of the time, Mon is at pains to make us lose ourselves in the special reality, in the mimetic accuracy and believability of this world that he has created, this sanatorium in the mountains. He's at pains most of the time to make us forget that what we're reading is fiction. And it's interesting that these detailed evocations of the sanitarium and of illness are almost exclusively confined to Hans's perception and perspective. Now, Henry James would call this narrative method a single center of consciousness, and Henry James would note that when you limit yourself primarily to a single consciousness in rendering a believable world, you heighten the realism still more because you eliminate the shifts to other points of view, say that we find in Women in Love, shifts that James says would disrupt the mimetic illusion, because every time we move from one mind to another, which we can't do in life, we're reminded it's a fiction. Well, the fact is that Mon's narrator, while perhaps technically omniscient in that he's all-knowing and certainly could tell us what Claudia or Settembrini were thinking, doesn't. He confines himself almost exclusively to Hans for much of the novel in order to help us sustain the sense that we're inhabiting a real world. Until, as I've noted, we suddenly then get these decidedly metafictive maneuvers, these decidedly un-Jamesian maneuvers that call attention to the artifice of the enterprise by having the narrator talk about himself. Why then this double movement? Why does Mon pull us so deeply into Hans's world through Hans's mind and make it so deeply believable and then suddenly pull us out of it? The answer, I think, is that Mon doesn't want us to become too profoundly attached to Hans. He wants us, in order to understand and judge Hans in a clear, balanced way, to recognize this double perspective in which we are inside his mind and then suddenly look at him from a great comic or ironic remove. Now, much as Hans himself adopts dualistic and compound points of view and evaluates them through juxtaposition, in a certain sense, technically, Mon's method makes us do that. Just as the novel is structured upon a dialect of competing ideas that often collapse into one another or reveal a kind of ironic similitude, so too Mon employs a kind of stylistic dialectic that forces us to balance our sympathetic identification with Hans, through whom we see so much, with an ability at certain moments to stand back and evaluate him from a position of critical detachment. And yet, note, even in the passage I read, even as the narrator tells us that he is writing this and that the next 3 weeks will go by far, far more quickly than the 3 weeks he has narrated here before, even as he does that, he also tells us that he is trying to match our experience of time in reading the story to Hans's in experiencing it, thereby bringing us back again to an identification with Hans, which he has just a moment before dissolved. Okay, let's turn now to the X-ray. It's one of the devices that inform that word magic in the novel's title, the Zauberberg, okay? Zauber meaning magic, berg, mountain. The events that unfold here often make Hans feel as if he is in a world of magic, in a kind of supernatural setting. Now, the X-ray is a big part of this. In one sense, X-ray machinery is, after all, a visual technology, all right? And it takes its place in this respect among other visual technologies that Mann describes early in the novel that are available at the Berghof, but largely for purposes of entertainment. But they all seem to grow out of a similar kind of optical technology in the late 19th century and early 20th. We're told that in the parlor there were optical gadgets for amusement. The first, a stereoscopic viewer, through the lenses which you stared at photographs you inserted into it. A Venetian gondolier, for example, in all his bloodless and rigid substantiality. The second, a long tube-like kaleidoscope that you put up to one eye, and turning it a little ring with the other hand, you could conjure up a magical fluctuation of colorful stars and arabesques. And finally, a little rotating drum, in which you placed a strip of cinematographic film and then looked through the opening slits on one side to watch a miller wrestle with a chimney sweep, a schoolmaster paddle a pupil, a tightrope walker do somersaults, or a farmer and his wife dance a rustic waltz. This is the regime of visual technology. But what distinguishes the X-ray from these entertainment gadgets is not just that it's used for diagnostic purposes rather than amusement, but more important, that instead of simply projecting images outward, like the kinetoscope, that thing that is turned with little slits, instead of projecting images outward cinematographically, the X-ray first penetrates the body so that it can then read and present on a glass slide an image of what lies inside. In short, before there is a visual manifestation, there is first a penetration. Now, the semi-darkness and the strange flickering lights of the X-ray room seem to make it like a place of sorcery, a place of magic. But before Hans even enters and beholds the mysteries of his own physical interior, as if by magic, as he is waiting in the waiting room, who should appear in the room with him but Klavdia? She walks in. Now, after his weeks of bed rest, Hans's passion for her has certainly not diminished, and now it revives with a new intensity, so powerfully that he sometimes, we're told, even before this, puts his hand, one on his head and one on his brow, and whispers, "My God." These are the same words, "my God," that he will utter when he looks at what the X-rays disclose, and appropriately so, because Hans knows that his love for Klavdia Shoshat is bound up with the illness that lies within inside her and inside himself. He cannot separate his desire for her from his fascination with bodily corruption and with death, which he knows that they both share. Thus, we're told that when she walks in, from behind his brow, where he held his hand, were thoughts or half-thoughts that first conferred true cloying sweetness to his visions and images, thoughts that centered on Madame Chauchat's carelessness and brazenness, on the illness that accentuated and enhanced her body, the illness that embodied her very being, and that he now shared with her according to a medical dictum. The realization of this shared illness formed behind his brow that Madame Chauchat was taking utter license with those looks and smiles, totally disregarding their not being social acquaintances, as if they were not social creatures at all, as if there were no need for them even to speak to one another. That terrified him, this language of glances, this shared knowledge. But of course it also deeply, deeply arouses him. Like Swann with Odette, Hans has longed to infiltrate Klavdia's private life. He has asked questions about her, stirred by waves of jealousy when he hears she entertains a male visitor sometimes, and even when he learns that Behrens has painted her portrait. So that when Klavdia now enters the waiting room, Hans, in this state of longing, of fascination, of wanting to know everything about her and possess somehow a grasp of her inner life, as he sits in the waiting room with her, he lets his eyes play silently over her body, as they had done during Krakowski's lecture, only now more brazenly, looking at her, as it were, with a kind of X-ray, which is reminiscent, if you will, of the one that he's about to see put into use, but also a kind of X-ray vision reminiscent of the way in which Behrens and Krakowski first looked at Hans in a penetrating understanding when they first saw him. His gaze, of course, is driven by profound desire. And now the slender outline of the whole leg of the woman was visible under the blue fabric of Klavdia's skirt. Hans gazes. Her back rounded and her shoulders hunched so that the bones of her neck stuck out. You could almost see her spinal column under the close-fitting sweater. Her breasts, which were not voluptuous and high, unlike high set like Marissa's, but small breasts of a young girl, were pressed together from both sides. And suddenly Hans Castorp recalled that she was also here waiting to be X-rayed. The director was painting her, interpreting her external appearance with color and oils on canvas, but there in the twilight, Behrens would turn rays on Klavdia that would expose her inside, the inside of her body. Hans wants to know the inside of her body. He wants to know the inside of her mind. Now, note that it is entirely fitting that Klavdia should be present here as Hans awaits the X-ray machine to disclose the secrets of his own lungs, the state of his own bodily infirmity, because after all, she is the immediate cause of that infection in him. Like the hidden infection itself, Hans's desire for her has up until this point been to a large degree concealed, a secret at least from others. Their silent language of glances has been unnoticed, except by a few, specifically Joachim and Frau Engelbert. They've both recognized, but otherwise no one knows. Well, when Behrens invites Hans into the X-ray room to look at an X-ray of Joachim's chest cavity before his own X-ray, the moment is transformative, and it causes Hans to murmur that same astonished phrase he did in thinking about his longing for Klavdia. My God. Consider this extraordinary moment in the novel. In response to much begging, Behrens was kind enough to allow his patient to view first Joachim's skeleton and then his own hand. We're told that when he looks at Joachim, the viewer gazed tirelessly at Joachim's sepulchral form, his dry bones, his bare scaffolding, his gaunt memento mori. He was filled with both reverence and terror. Yes, I see it, Hans, several times. I see it. My God, I see it. Now, you'll note that at this moment, beyond Hans's compassion that he feels for Joachim's afflicted lungs, is a fascination and even a sense of transgression. He was deeply moved by what he saw, or more accurately, by being able to see it. But Hans was also stung by secret doubts, whether it might not be somehow abnormal after all, doubts about whether it was permissible to stare like this amid the quivering, crackling darkness, a deep desire to enjoy the indiscretion blended with feelings of compassion and piety for his cousin, whose skeleton he's looking at. Note that the feeling of compassion is mixed with a sense of transgression, of seeing something that God-fearing men aren't meant to see, the insides of another's body. And also with an awareness that what lies at the center of the human frame, a skeleton, a visible manifestation of human mortality, is the universal emblem of death itself. What he sees when he looks at Joachim's skeleton, both with a sense of reverence and with a sense of unhealthy fascination, is death, that thing that he's been drawn to spiritually and physically. So entranced is Hans by this glimpse of death that a moment later he asks Behrens to let him look at his own X-ray, his own body. And so Behrens shows Hans what his hand looks like. In response to much begging, Behrens was kind enough to allow his patient to view his own hand through the fluoroscope. And Hans Castorp saw exactly what he should have expected to see, but which no man was ever intended to see, and which he himself had never presumed he would ever be able to see. He saw his own grave. Under that light, he saw the process of corruption anticipated, saw the flesh in which he moved, decomposed, expunged, dissolved into airy nothingness. And inside, the delicately turned skeleton of his right hand, and around his last joint of the ring finger, dangling black and loose, was the signet ring his grandfather had bequeathed him. A hard thing, this ore, which man adorns his body with, predestined to melt away beneath that, so that it can be free again and move on yet another flesh. It may bear it for a while. For the first time in his life, Hans understood that he would die. Now, Hans's sudden realization on looking at the X-ray skeleton of his hand, his sudden revelation that he is mortal, that he's not just interested in death, but that death applies to him, that he could die of this disease, rather than filling him with fear, is strangely exhilarating. The attraction to death is not just death in others, but a fascination with his own mortality. In his own bones, the bones of his hand, he sees as if he were looking into his own grave, because of course that's what he will look like in his grave. He would be a skeleton. The bones that underlie the pale, easily dissolving envelope of flesh, that ghostly shadow on the screen, those bones are at the heart of human life, but they are also the manifestation and residue, the symbol of death. But you'll note that there is one other thing distinctly visible in the X-ray besides these bones, to which Hans knows he will be reduced one day in death. Something else in this X-ray that by implication resists death by persisting after death along with the bones beyond the duration of the friable flesh. And what is that? His grandfather's signet ring, which is passed down through generations like the baptismal bowl and plate. Although men die, although their flesh is temporary and melts away, the ring is a marker of identity that moves from finger to finger, from generation to generation of wearers through time. And as such, this ring, this bequeathed hard object that is worn through generations, becomes for man a symbol of mythic identity that in some way persists beyond the death of any individual. The mythic identities that men and women occupy in life, like this ring, endure because they originated in our forebears before our birth, and they persist in our descendants, these roles, after our death. As such, these mythic personalities that we inhabit are, like the ring, ancestral ring itself, something that goes on. They are at the same time not merely a marker of the perpetuation of human life through generations, but specifically markers of who we are insofar as we inhabit the same roles as others, as our forebears before us. In short, in this X-ray vision, we're given not merely a vision of death, but a vision of mythic identity rooted in enduring typology, arising from a racial inheritance symbolized by Hans's inheritance of the family signet ring. Now, this begs an important question, I think, that we're going to explore in coming classes. What is, after all, Hans's own appropriate mythic identity? Mann believes, of course, that we all inhabit one, and he believes that some individuals in a condition of lived myth can become aware of it. We're going to have to consider the degree that Hans becomes aware of it, but first there's the question of what his specific mythic prototype is. This young man who isn't any longer a bourgeois, but who clearly isn't an artist either. This individual who is drawn to both the Apollonian and Dionysian aspects of life and death. this hybrid individual whose curiosity about life and death, body and soul, moves him in so many different directions intellectually, as if in some way he is a being, it seems, of almost unlimited potential for becoming, but still yet undefined, or even for the reader, undefined in our minds as a particular mythic figure. Well, Hans senses this unresolved potential in himself, the still unfixed and undisclosed sense of his identity, as he suggests this to Behrens this way. He says, Herr Director, sometimes I've asked myself if I shouldn't become a doctor. In a certain sense, I think I would not have done badly at it. Because if a man is interested in the body, he's also interested in illness, particularly in that, isn't he? Not that it means all that much, by the way. I could have also become any number of things. I could have become a clergyman, too, you know. Well, whatever Hans proves to be, his attraction to Claudia is central to the myth that his life will take. So Mann makes us wonder then, after all, since Claudia is so essential to Hans's self-actualization, why Hans continues to hold back, not declaring himself, or even speaking to her, but instead thrilling when their eyes meet, or when she smiles at him, or when he notices the sun in her eyes and adjusts the curtain so that she will appreciate the gesture. This language of silent transactions. Why not simply introduce himself, reveal himself? Well, part of Hans's delay has something to do is akin to Swann. It is partly, as with Swann and Odette, a pleasure of desiring in itself and holding back from the contact that would in any way threaten that distanced desiring. A pleasure, as with Swann, in the protracted and incremental voluptuous delight of a slow approach. But Hans also holds back, of course, for another reason. It's because he lacks the language in which to approach Claudia. Not just a common spoken tongue, but also he lacks a sense of the code of customs that would allow him, this man from the flatlands, to convey his turbulent, complex craving for her diseased flesh. He thinks that, quote, formal pronouncements and bows and conversation of a civilized relationship would, quote, not be the right thing at all. No, there simply isn't any way that he's familiar with, any idiom he's familiar with in terms of behavior that he can think of to do it. In short, he doesn't know how to express what he feels. But working against Hans's hesitancy and inhibition and the pleasures of a kind of distant desiring, there is a countervailing force, of course, one that we also saw in Swann. It is a desire for possession, suggested in that desire to know her insides in every single way. A desire for both carnal and emotional knowledge of Claudia and of Hans's own submerged Dionysian self through a knowledge of Claudia. This seems made clear on a number of occasions. We're told of this tension in his desire, this longing to both to approach and to hold back. On the one hand, Hans's love was caught up, and with such an immediacy that it could make the young man blanch and grimace in Frau Schutz's knee, the contour of her leg, her back, the nape of her neck, her upper arms, and the way they pressed her small breasts together. In brief, he was caught up in her body, in her careless body, so accentuated and vastly enhanced by her illness that it was a second embodiment of her body. He loved to gaze at it. On the other hand, his love was something utterly elusive and amorphous, a thought, no, a dream, a terrifying and infinitely seductive dream of a young man whose answer to certain, though subconsciously posed questions, would have been only hollow silence. Note that we're then told Hans Castorp could not have stayed with the people up here, even this long, beyond his originally planned date of departure, if only some sort of satisfactory answer about the meaning and purpose of his life had been supplied to his prosaic soul out of the depths of time. He goes on a little bit later, we are told, that despite the fact that part of him wants to relish an infinitely seductive dream and to delay possessing or touching the contour of her leg, the back of her neck, of her nape, as he is torn between a kind of longing from a distance and a desire for physical proximity and possession, we're told, yet we would remind our readers that as a rule, inherent in the condition in which Hans Kors found himself is an urge, a compulsion to reveal oneself, a need to be open and to confess a blind prejudice in one's own favor, and a rage to fill the world with oneself through such exposures. Thus, the tension I have described. Driven by this compulsion, as Mann calls it, this need to reveal himself against the subjective pleasures of gazing from a distance and relishing Claudia, Hans's unconstrained interest in her becomes so obvious that it actually becomes a source of amusement for all the other residents, who now realize that he is obsessed with her because they watch him watch her, especially during the distribution of mail on Sundays. In following Claudia with his eyes, Hans clearly wants to do more than just visually gaze upon her and relish her beauty as a dream. He wants to enter her being in some way, physically and metaphysically. After watching her, in fact, we're told, he tries to imitate Claudia's posture and movements as if by doing so he could somehow inhabit her being. He tried out what it was like to let his back go limp and sit slumped in his chair at meals, and he found it greatly relaxed the abdominal muscles. Moreover, Hans tried out going through a door without troubling to latch it behind him, but merely letting it close by itself, and that proved both convenient and easy. As if by doing what Claudia does, making his face conform to those particular movements and his body, he could somehow understand her. Now, remember that we recall Hans had also tried to understand what he took to be something very different as a state of being. The contrasting spiritual state of a dying man he saw briefly. He tried to imitate the movement of that man's eyes so as to somehow grasp what he took to be the spiritual condition of his imminent passage into the realm of the soul. Well, ultimately, what Hans is trying to do here, of course, is to know Claudia in the fullest Dionysian sense, one might say, the fullest bodily sense, but beyond that, to grasp through her by somehow becoming as if one with her, to grasp through that union a part of his own bifurcated nature that she reflects. Okay, remember, it is his desire for himself in her, though he doesn't yet understand that is what he seeks. Now, he doesn't really consciously understand that, but Mann assures us it is the case in that passage I just finished reading, specifically in these lines. Hans Hastorp would not have stayed with the people up here even this long beyond his originally planned date of departure if only some sort of satisfactory answer about the meaning and purpose of his life had been supplied to his prosaic soul from out of the depths of time. Now, that phrase, from out of the depths of time, is extremely rich and important. It's a key phrase because Mann reminds us again that Hans's desire for Claudia is narcissistic, that he's seeking to know a part of himself as he as seen in her, in much the same way that out of the depths of time, in the most ancient depths of time, Adam Quadman sought himself by embracing his own reflection, okay, thinking it was other when in fact it was himself. But also note that more broadly, Hans seeking, as Mann describes it here, answers to questions about the meaning and purpose of his life and who he is. The answer to those questions also lie in what Mann speaks of as the depths of time, in the immemorial past, in myth and racial memory. That is where he must seek it, and seeking it through his love for Claudia, that self-knowledge, will be part of this. Well, to seek himself then, to pursue knowledge of both the world and his own being in the fullest sense, becomes, for Hans, from this point of the novel on, the fundamental purpose of his life, both consciously and unconsciously. And for Hans, the ability to seek himself and to understand the world and his position in the world, that becomes for Hans what he calls freedom. The very condition of fluid, wide-ranging intellectual liberty, and for that matter, even a kind of unconscious liberty that one doesn't try to repress during his stay at the sanatorium, that stay that provides him with that condition of unregulated psychic activity, that for Hans is freedom. And when Hans then sends a third letter back home explaining that he will indeed be staying at the Berghof for at least 6 months, we're told he feels this wave, this sense, this surge of freedom. Not just freedom from the demands of the bourgeois workaday world, but a freedom in following the inclinations of himself, both intellectual and passionate, following those intellectual and passionate inclinations wherever they might lead him. We're told it established, this letter, Hans Castorp's freedom. This was the word he used, not explicitly, but by forming the syllables in his mind, but as something rather he felt in its most comprehensive sense, in the sense in which he had learned to understand it during his stay here. Freedom in that sense, though that was a sense that had little to do with the meaning, say, that Settembrini attached to the word freedom. Freedom for Hans is the ability to take information from various sources and fields, from medicine to metaphysics. It's the freedom to question all orthodoxies. It's the freedom to juxtapose ideas dialectically. It's the freedom to speculate and to dream and to ponder paradox and to look within himself. It's the freedom to follow his desires. Very different from Settembrini. Now, as with so many other big words, different characters obviously define freedom differently, revealing the limits of language that lie not just in the difficulty of abstract concepts themselves, which are difficult to map to a particular concept the way a word can be mapped to a particular object, but also revealing in the variety of ways in which people define freedom the subjective needs of individuals that make communication difficult, since we use the same words to mean different things. Now, Settembrini in particular defines freedom rather idiosyncratically in the context of his Apollonian worldview, almost, one might say, as narrowly and idiosyncratically as Birkin defines freedom, you remember, in Women in Love. For Settembrini, freedom means the intellectual pursuit of a worldwide political liberty through the power of directed reason and intellect. Freedom for Settembrini is not the license to experiment with different ideas the way Hans defines freedom, but rather, for Settembrini, freedom is to direct one's energies toward perfecting human civilization. Another word that he defines subjectively, civilization. Well, knowledge, Krakowski says, makes men ripe for freedom, but only specific kinds of freedom. He too defines it, interestingly, in a different way. Now, for Settembrini, the key to freedom is rational understanding, okay? It doesn't, this rational understanding, involve any knowledge of our bodies or our instincts or our darker desires. Krakowski would say you are free when you understand you're unconscious. Settembrini would say the very desire to understand your unconscious, if it exists, is a sign in some ways that you are working against freedom, which is meaningful only in the context of the individual will working for universal brotherhood. Well, note then that in contrasting Hans's and Settembrini's and Krakowski's conceptions of freedom, Mann raises several questions here about the very possibilities of freedom in any sense. Think of it. Is Hans really free to resist Claudia if she embodies a part of his own nature to which he is compulsively and irresistibly drawn? Okay. Second, to what extent is any individual free if his or her mythic identity and life course has been assigned at birth out of the collective unconscious? To what extent then, since we cannot in some way select our particular mythic identity, but must, it would appear, live it out, to what extent does that confer any freedom on the individual? And finally, does the only existential freedom for the individual then lie in discovering the role that we are meant to play out mythically and consciously, deliberately performing it? Well, if that is the case, it's notable that Hans has not yet even begun to ask any of these questions. But he is increasingly skeptical of Settembrini's restrictive conceptions of freedom and knowledge. And in particular, he objects to Settembrini's denigration of the body and exclusive focus on the mind in questions of knowledge, okay? It seems that Settembrini would prefer that human beings didn't even have bodies, that they didn't have these corporeal envelopes at all. And Hans finds that rather narrow and rather irritating. Settembrini says, there is one force, one principle that is the object of my highest affirmation, my highest ultimate respect and love, and that force is the principle of the mind, the principle of the intellect. Within the antithesis, Settembrini says, of the body and mind, it is the body that is evil, devilish principle, because the body is nature, and nature as an opposing force, I repeat, to mind or reason, body is evil, mystical, and evil is the body. Did you know that the great Plotinus is recorded to have said that he was ashamed to have a body? You behold, then, the mind's enmity toward the body, toward nature, its proud mistrust of her, its great-hearted insistence on the right to criticize the body as evil, on the body's irrational power. One must respect and defend the body only when it serves the cause of the emancipation of beauty. One must otherwise despise it, insofar as the principle of gravity and inertia in the body opposing the flow toward light, and insofar as it represents the principle of disease and death, insofar as the body is the quintessence of matter and perversity, of corruption, of lust and disgrace. Jeez. Well, Hans's discontent not only with Settembrini's strict division between mind good, body bad, which contradicts his own experience of illness through love, which has stimulated his mind, but Hans is also discontent with something else in this dualistic scheme, this binary. Hans knows that human life means having a body, and that to disdain one's physical nature, to seek to discard one's body, as Settembrini does, when he refers to the body as our organic animal component and sees the body as a scandalous offense, to do that, as Settembrini does, Hans notes, is ultimately to hate humanity, since we are all, after all, embodied. And Hans points this out, this contradiction in Settembrini, who says he is above all things a humanist and who therefore ought to love mankind in its totality, body and mind. What do you have against the body, Herr Settembrini? Hans Castorp interrupted quickly, staring at him with large blue eyes, the whites broken with bloodshot veins. You are a humanist, are you not? And if you are, how can you say such bad things about the body? It appears that Settembrini's love for humanity is somewhat selective. Just as Settembrini artificially distinguishes mind from body, so too he divides the human race into two camps. On the one hand, there is what he calls the European, by which he means those members of the human race drawn to Apollonian traits of classical form, idealism, reason, and, as he sees it, progress, an exalted race of energetic idealists capable of undertaking, for example, a vast encyclopedia volume on which he is working that will classify and diagnose all forms of human suffering in life and literature, in the belief that understanding suffering will let man eliminate it. On the other side, there is the part of mankind that Settembrini calls the Asiatic, typified by Russians like those of the Berghof, whose instinctual urges and passions, bred in that vast, formless land, he fears have infected Hans Castorp. As, for example, when he observes, you prefer Oriental metaphors. Yes. But you know, Asia is devouring us. Tartar faces in every direction you look. And Herr Settembrini discreetly turned his head to glance over his shoulder. Genghis Khan, he said, lone wolves on dusky steppes, snow and schnapps and whips and scrouts, prisons and holy orthodoxy. They ought to erect a statue to Pallas Athena here in the lobby as a kind of self-defense against those people. Hans Castorp laughed at something something Settembrini never did. One could not even imagine Settembrini ever laughing heartily. He managed little more than a dry, delicate tightness in one corner of his mouth at what Hans, at Hans's antics. But Hans, we are told, laughs at this description of how they should erect the Greek goddess to defend them against the Eastern hordes at the Berghof. Now, Pallas Athena, this statue that Settembrini suggests ought to be erected there, Pallas Athena, remember, is the sister of Apollo, okay, linked with the Apollonian. She is the enlightened alternative in human nature, as Settembrini conceives of it, to Asiatic irrationalism, which he sees in all of the Russian patients at both the good and the bad tables, and certainly in Claudia. What Settembrini calls Asiatic is really a synonym then for the Dionysian, because although he doesn't utter that name or that god, he implies Dionysius. Remember that Dionysius is the god of alcohol, drunkenness, song and dance, unbridled instinct, erotic pleasure, and madness, but also insofar as it is part and parcel of the aesthetic or the artist type, the Dionysian is also the god of creative frenzy. In short, all the things that Settembrini fears in the world, fears in some submerged part of himself, and sees embodied in Russia and Claudia Chauchat in particular. Now, although Dionysius was a god in the Greco-Roman pantheon, in some versions of the myth, it's notable that Dionysius is presented as a stranger arriving from Asia, thus the association with Settembrini's category of the Asiatic as instinctive and dangerous. A source of inspiration, of course, creatively, as Nietzsche would have it, but certainly for Settembrini, an enemy of the Apollonian and form. Now, in Settembrini's warnings to Hans, there is another mythic figure that he does, however, explicitly name. He doesn't mention Dionysius as the opposite of Apollo or Pallas Athena, but he does refer to this figure from Greek mythology. Avoid that swamp, Hans, that isle of Circe, for you are not Odysseus enough to dwell there unharmed. You will walk on all fours. You are tripping down onto your front limbs, and already soon you will be gaunt. Beware on that isle of Circe. Circe was a beautiful witch who turned Odysseus's men into pigs and kept him as her lover. But Odysseus was protected from her power, dehumanizing power, by a special herb, one that in this passage Settembrini figuratively believes Hans lacks in his attraction to Claudia. She will destroy and reduce him, he imagines, to something horrible. Now, Settembrini doesn't have to mention Claudia by name here, because Hans knows exactly in this reference to Circe whom Settembrini is referring to. And Settembrini is right about one thing. Hans is not a Odysseus. He's not a Ulysses figure. He can't resist her and does not resist her. But beyond that, he is not, let us put it this way, whatever his myth may be, it is not like Leopold Bloom and Ulysses, the myth of Odysseus, okay? Because Hans, we are told, is not, as Settembrini suggests, an adventurer in action. Rather, one might say, Hans is an experimental adventurer in thought and sensation. But that, of course, all takes place in one location. Whatever his mythic identity proves to be, it is not that of the Greek hero, Odysseus, who roves across the known world for 10 years. Instead, Hans finds adventures in remaining in the same place for 7. Now, note that Hans rejects Settembrini's warnings against Claudia, nowhere more so than in referring to the ideal of form, as I mentioned earlier, to namby-pamby nonsense. Now, that particular statement comes shortly after he has seen Claudia's portrait in Baron's apartment. Hans is clearly, at that moment, rebelling against Settembrini's warning against Claudia, and for that matter, against Settembrini's entire Apollonian rationalist approach to life and art. Another of Hans's rebellions against Settembrini concerns the word irony. It is obviously a crucial one for a novelist as profoundly ironic as Thomas Mann. And I noted that it operates in multiple registers. Settembrini, you might say, uses irony constantly in a way, with his references to the dining room as a refectory and reference to Barons as one of the judges of Hades. But that's irony as self-defense. It's irony as mockery of a place that Settembrini hates, and the irony helps sustain him there. He calls it rhetorical irony. But Settembrini warns Hans against an ironic perspective on life at large because Settembrini sees it as leading to cynicism, as is evident, for example, in Frau Kleefeld and her friends, something that causes impressionable souls, he imagines, like Hans, to move toward nihilism, toward an attitude of hopelessness that could cause one to give up on the task of moving humanity forward and upward. No, irony is dangerous in that respect. Beware of irony that flourishes here, my good engineer. Beware in general of it as an intellectual stance. It becomes a source of depravity, a barrier to civilization, a squalid flirtation with inertia, nihilism, and vice. And since the atmosphere in which we live here provides a very favorable condition for this swamp plant of irony to flourish, I may hope, or at least I may fear, that you do understand me, and I tell you now, avoid it. Hans's own approach to irony, however, is quite different. Like Mann, his is an modernist ironic sensibility, a irony in the modernist sense in that he plays with concepts freely and refuses to conclude with certainty about any of them, certainly rejects the kinds of certainties that Settembrini preaches and Settembrini believes that reason demands. Hans, on the other hand, finds that paradoxes and half-truths and the play of ideas posed against one another, that particular ironic approach to the world is stimulating and vastly amusing. I mention amusing because remember, Mann tells us that while Hans Castorp often laughs, heartily, even hysterically, Settembrini never laughs. Quote, he could manage nothing more than a dry, delicate tightness at the corner of his mouth. His own irony is self-defense. His own rhetorical irony doesn't amuse him. Now, Settembrini associates hilarity in particular in laughter with a loss of control, with a kind of Dionysian irrationalism. But there is surely something deficient in Settembrini's repression of laughter. And I mention this because in an essay written late in his life, Thomas Mann stresses the importance of laughter as distinct from irony of other kinds. He says, critics assign my own work so definitely and completely to the realm of irony and consider me an ironist through and through without also taking into account the concept of humor, which in my case I cannot, I think, and should not be completely ignored. Let me put matters in an extreme way. Irony, it seems to me, is in the spirit of art, which draws a smile from the reader or listener, an intellectual smile, I might call it, while humor induces the laughter that wells up from the heart. This I personally rate higher as the effect of art and welcome it more happily when it is the effect of my own productions than the Erasmus-like smile which irony evokes. I must say, that I have read aloud a great deal in my life, and every time my reading evoked a hearty laugh in the auditorium, I was the most pleased and I felt happiest on the platform. Now, note, there are indeed moments of comedy in The Magic Mountain, I think, in which we are made to laugh rather heartily, as, for example, at the antics of Nurse Melendock. And Mann wants us to enjoy these moments fully. But just as Settembrini frowns upon laughter and most kinds of irony or most kinds of sort of bodily humor that might produce that laughter, similarly, in a cautionary spirit, he tells Hans to avoid paradoxes, okay? He calls paradox, quote, the poisonous flower of a putrefied mind. Paradox is dangerous in Settembrini's view because it's full of an inherent contradiction. And as such, because it embraces contradiction, it challenges rational thought and invites a submission to a kind of depraved relativism or even irrationalism. Yet we know Hans and Mann both delight in paradoxes, including the paradoxes of Settembrini himself. Here's a man who celebrates science, beginning with Darwin, but regards Baron's medical treatments with disdain. Here's a man who yearns to heal his body, and yet rebels against the prescribed cures. Here's a man who regards illness as a moral degradation, and yet is himself ill as an intellectual. Paradoxically, in the worst sense, for Settembrini, Hans points out that in regarding illness as a secondary phenomenon, as a reflection of some interior state, Settembrini is actually in agreement with his antagonist Krakowski. And as we'll see, increasingly, Hans finds dialectical opposites meet whenever they reach their extremities. Okay. Now, and as we're also going to see more broadly through Mann, although the novel traffics in opposites and dialectical contrasts, what will happen is that these binaries will ultimately collapse, that one cannot understand the world through binaries, even though in a certain sense they are a necessary part of that attempted understanding. Now, I want to conclude today, briefly, with Hans's visit to Behrens' apartment, where he sees the portrait of Claudia Behrens has painted and discusses the relationship between art and the body. Behrens is, like so many characters, a bundle of contradictions himself. He is both a man of science and an amateur artist. He is externally jovial with everyone, but inwardly depressive ever since his wife's death years before. He's a man given to fits of melancholy. And Behrens dispenses rigid instructions to his patients while himself drinking and smoking cigars freely, once almost fatally. Now, Hans knows that the director did a portrait of Claudia, and he's been curious about it. He's wanted to see it with tremendous expectation. And when he does, after Behrens invites Hans and Joachim for coffee, it becomes clear that insofar as Behrens is an artist, Behrens is a Dionysian artist. An artist who delights in material forms, from landscapes and still lifes to human subjects. He serves coffee, Behrens does, as an Apollonian or a Dionysian artist figure, out of a dispenser with an erotic design on it that was given to him by an Egyptian princess. And in painting Claudia, Behrens tried to evoke the special mysteries of her innermost female body, to try to show those on canvas, not in an X-ray, but in the medium of paint. When he shows it, it was a bust in half profile, somewhere smaller than half life, with the neck bared, a veil draped across the shoulders and breasts, set in a wide black beveled frame in gold nearest the canvas. Frost looked 10 years older than she was, as usually happens when amateurs try to capture a character. There was too much red in her face. The nose was very badly drawn. The hair color was wrong, almost that of straw. The mouth was askew. The special fascination of her features had not been brought out, but was not even apparent, but only coarsened by exaggeration. The whole thing was a rather botched job. The portrait only vaguely corresponded to the model. But Hans Castorp was not at all that scrupulous about the issue of resemblance. The relationship between Frost as a person and that of the piece of canvas was enough for him. He looks at it and sees somehow, despite these external misrepresentations, Behrens has captured something of her inner being. She lives and breathes, Hans repeated. She lives and breathes, for him at least. Now, Behrens' portrait conveys, for Hans, a penetrating understanding of Claudia's body and form and being beneath the surface. He sees deep into the skin and fat and inner organs somehow in this portrait. Not in a cold anatomical way, though, rather in one that is more evocative. Because despite its technical failures, Hans sees that the painting captures the corruptible corporeality of Claudia that so fascinates him. We're told in this respect that you could imagine you saw perspiration, the invisible vapors of life rising from the flesh, that if you were to press your lips against the surface of the painting, you would smell a human body, not paint and varnish. Well, Behrens explains to him the knowledge that went into this kind of X-ray vision, a knowledge of the female figure. Hips and breast in particular, Behrens says, are a product of fat tissue beneath the skin. How the skin itself, though we don't see it, is composed of cells and moistened by sweat glands beneath. How the slant of Claudia's eyes and what Behrens calls the titillating little mystery of her slanted eyes is produced by a particular fold of skin. Now, Hans is not disillusioned by this would-be dissection of Claudia's organic body because he has never idealized her as a work of art, say the way Swann does Odette. No, instead he has desired her from the beginning with a desire for penetration, a fascination with the alluring forms of her body as disease-ridden. And he wants to know her then from the inside, not merely to get inside her, so to speak, physically and metaphysically, but to understand the mystery, the organic mystery of her own corruptible flesh. Behrens' painting is a repudiation, clearly, of Settembrini's Apollonian concept of artistic form as a kind of disembodied symmetry, as proportion and abstract design. No, this is painting that maps the flesh from within as fully as it can. Through Behrens, Hans discovers that the outline of the female body, in even the most exalted works of sculpture, is produced, after all, that outline, by fat in the breasts and abdomen that underlie the form. Hans is so moved to delight by the organic mysteries of fat and dermal tissue and lymph disclosed in this portrait that he treats the painting like a living object. He carries it around Behrens' apartment, a moment that I think Mann would say we're supposed to heartily laugh at. And far from feeling jealousy at Behrens, as he listens to Behrens' intimate explanations of how organic chemistry has produced the ravishing, disease-ridden body of Claudia, far from being jealous, Hans is absolutely enraptured to hear this. Hans Kastrup said nothing. Yes, he remarked softly after a pause, it's true. I could easily have become a doctor now. The formation of breast milk, the lymph of the legs, it all interests me very much, doctor. The body, he suddenly cried in rapturous outburst. The flesh, the human body, what is it? What's it made of? Tell me. This very afternoon, doctor, Director Behrens, tell us once and for all the precise terms. What do we know? What are we made of? Well, Hans will use this same language of passionate inquiry about the body when he declares his love to Claudia. But before that, we must pass through two long, demanding chapters. That's it for the day. I'm sorry I've gone 15 minutes or so over the limit. But remember, you can turn me on and off here, something which my son said, I wish I'd been able to do that when I was a teenager. You can do it with these lectures, okay? You don't have to absorb them all at once. The next one will come following the spring break on Tuesday, March 24th. Look for it then. Have a nice St. Patrick's Day. Do what is necessary to get through this. Let me know if you have any questions or thoughts. You will be receiving your midterm exam grade and comment early next week. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye.